Today we'll spend half of this video making the sled and the other half tuning it. This sled stands out because of its front face design. I built the original sled 5 years ago with a fence that has two different grain directions. The braces, which are here and here, are end grain, while the main body is face grain. I noticed that the face grains shift with seasons while the end grain stays put. To keep the fence perfectly square, I'm switching to an all end grain fence. Another feature is the top mounted adjusting screws, making this a whole lot easier to build. Let's get started. I'm going to be using 24" by 24" panels. These are 3/4 of an inch thick. You should be able to buy these in any hardware store. When you go to pick these up, make sure you lay each edge on the floor and make sure that it's flat. Both pieces don't need to be flat, but you do need to have one piece that's very flat, because obviously we don't want this to rock on the table saw. We're going to try to keep this as simple as possible, and we're going to make everything hopefully with the table saw that we have. That includes the miter gauge. I'm going to start this off by cutting 13 inches down the center. With a 13-inch piece, I'm going to do a 3.5-inch piece, a 3-inch, and 3 2-inch pieces. With the remaining piece, we're going to be cutting out rails that will fit on the bottom of the sled and that will hold our sled to the table. In order for this to be an accurate sled, we need to make sure that they fit inside of the slots and that there's no play either way, but we don't want it to be too tight. Otherwise, you can end up having problems pushing it through, which can be dangerous later on. In order for this to fit inside of here, I need to have a 3/4 inch gap. So I'm just going to go slightly over 3/4 of an inch, and then later come back and sneak up on it a little bit. So if I go to try to fit this in here, it does not fit. It's just slightly off by just a hair. So I'm going to move this a hair's width, just a little tiny bit, and make a cut again. And when I go to slide this in, fits really good. There's no side to side play. That is exactly what I want. I'll go ahead now and make my second runner. I'm not done yet because they stick up above the surface by about 3/8 of an inch. I could place this in here and then mark where I need to cut it off, but we don't want it to rub against the bottom. So I'm going to add a couple pennies in here. Now I can draw a line on here, and by measuring this line, it looks like I need 3/8 of an inch altogether. I'll go ahead and add my spacers back, and again, these are just the pennies that I used earlier. And I can put my strips back in. Now I'm going to move my blade so that it's 10.5 inches away from the fence. And the reason that I'm setting this 10.5 inches away from the fence and not centering this up is that I want to have this a little bit offset. At this point, some people will put their screws through the top, but I'm going to add some glue to the bottom, put some weight on this, and then I'll come back and just add a couple screws later on. A couple 5-gallon buckets does a really good job of holding this down. While that dries, I'm going to go ahead and take my 3-inch piece as well as the 2-inch pieces, and I'm going to laminate them all together. Now that this is dry, I can focus on cleaning up this face. The nice thing about having this single edge over here is that I can use it to get a parallel surface on the other side. I'll go ahead and raise my blade so that it's above the top here by just a little bit. And I want to make sure that my blade is square at a 90 to the tabletop. If I put a square on this, I am looking really clean all the way across. To work on the rails now, because they're already glued on, I'm only going to put 3 screws in. I'm going to go 2 inches from each side and then 1 in the center. I'll add this to the top of my table again, but just long enough that I can mark where the blade is, which is right there. I'll take this off, and I need to add this back fence. I've added clamps to the back of this, and now I'm just going to mark where that center is, which is right there. And I'll be using some number 10 by 2-inch screws, which is complete overkill for this. But since I am drilling into plywood, the edge of it, I think that I really want as much support as I can from the screw. I'll put one in 2 inches from either side, and then I'm going to do it at 11 inches as well as 16 inches. I'm using a 5/32 drill bit to drill into the plywood because plywood is the most abysmal thing to drill into. In order to line up my front fence, I need to make a cut through this, but I don't want to cut all the way through. So I'm going to place this on the end and then just draw a line. so I know where to stop. I'll take my fence now and I'm going to flip it over, and I want to find where that cut's going to hit. So this is the bottom of the fence, and it looks like it's going to hit right here. I'll go ahead and transfer that over. With the extra piece, I'm going to cut off a section of it that will fit on the back of this, that will give me a little bit of protection so that I don't end up cutting myself with the blade later on. And I want to set my marking gauge to 7.5 inches. And I'll set this to 2 3/4. And this piece here will keep us from cutting our fingers off, which is a good thing. If I set my fence next to the blade here, I'm going to raise my blade so that it partially moves into the fence. So right about there, which is maybe 1/2 inch to 5/8 of an inch. This part right here will lay flat on the tabletop. So I want to turn this so that it's sitting upright. So the base here fits against my miter gauge, and I'll line up that mark that I made from the table saw blade right in the center of the blade here now. I'm going to make a series of cuts that will allow my piece of stock to fit inside of here. So I think I'm going to just go ahead and place this on here now and figure out where it's going to come out. So I need to make cuts up to about those marks right there. If we look at the overhead, you can see that this slides in. It's a loose fit. Maybe I'll add a little bit of a sliver on one side, but it's going to have some glue anyway. To finish off the fence, you may consider bringing your table saw fence over to your blade and then just taking off maybe 1/8 of an inch along the bottom here. You'll want your blade about 1/8 of an inch off the surface, and then again, 1/8 of an inch into the fence. This will give you a little dust channel. Some people really like this. I don't like it because I cut things that are really thin and that would just get stuck under my fence. So what I'll end up doing is cutting a channel inside of the sled itself. This gives me that dust channel without having to worry about a piece of stock that's really thin getting wedged inside of the fence. On this bottom corner, I'm going to add a screw. This will be my pivot screw so I know where to place my fence so that I'm at a 90 with the blade. With my sled, you can see that I've cut this little corner out here. It's not something that you need to do, but I want to be able to show the difference between making cuts. So I've got a screw here at an angle that will allow me to move my fence either in or out. That way I can show this a little bit better, give you some better examples. If you're going to make a table saw sled, it needs to be accurate. You want to make sure that your blade is at a 90 to your fence. I'll use a carpenter square to line up my fence. I'll be honest, carpenter squares get me pretty close to where I want to be with accuracy, but I'm going to be using a feeler gauge to get myself just a little bit closer. Once I've added my second screw, I'm going to be using 2 different methods to find that accuracy. The first method is a 2-cut system using 2 pieces of wood. And then I'll show you William Ing's method, which uses 1 long piece of wood with 5 different cuts. When you use a carpenter square with the blade, the teeth on the blade cannot touch the carpenter square. You need to be straight against the bare metal of the saw blade. This might mean that you need to go to a 40 tooth if you've got some kind of fine tooth blade. And then I'm going to come down here to this side and I'm going to move my fence so that it is at a 90 with it. I'll take a clamp and I'll lock this side down, and you'll want to come in here and add a screw. Once that's done and you've added your screw, you can go ahead and take off the clamp. Again, I'm using an angle screw to hold my fence in place temporarily instead of adding the screw. With the first method, I have a scrap piece of sheet wood that I'm going to cut right down the middle. The edge here needs to be straight, but it's the only edge that needs to be straight. And the first thing that I want to do is take my piece here and I need to cut it into 2 pieces. This is my first one. I've already got what I think is a 90 right here. I'm going to set this to the side, take this edge here, and I'm going to flip this over and place it up against my fence. Now I'll take the number 1, I'll place it against the fence, and I'm going to flip over the number 2 one like that. I'll push this forward and check to see if my edges line up. And from what I see right here, I don't see any gaps either on the top or the bottom. I'll add a screw down here, and then I'm going to remove that screw, and then I'm going to move my adjustment screw over here so that this is not gonna be in alignment. We'll make our cuts again, and we'll see what it looks like, and then from there, we'll see if we can fix it. I'll go ahead and add a mark here, showing that this is where I think that this is all squared up, and I can remove my screw. I'll move the fence forward, and I want to raise my screw a little bit so that it is out of square. First one's in place. I'll take my second one, flip it over, and then we'll line it up. And already I can see that I am meeting at the bottom, but not at the top. And that's how this works. If my fence is too high, I'm gonna have a gap at the top. If my fence is too low, I'm gonna have a gap at the bottom. We'll fix the fence being too high right now. If I use a feeler gauge, I can slide the 9/1000th of an inch blade in there, but you've got to remember that the error is doubled here. So if I cut 9/1000ths of an inch in half, it's going to be about 0.004 or 4/1000ths of an inch. Now to fix this, I'm going to take my stock and put it back against the blade, like that. Right here where the corner is, I'll mark a little line. To raise or lower this fence edge, we're going to take one of our pieces and put it on that mark that we made. If the fence is too high, we'll add a clamp. We'll take out the screw, we'll add this so that this slides in, and then we'll move our fence up against it, and then we'll drill another hole and add a screw. If the fence is too low, we'll slide our feeler in and then place our block up next to it. And now we can add our clamp, remove our screw, and then push it up. And then at that time, we'll drill a hole and add a screw. Flip this over, and we look very good. So that's how you'll end up fixing this if you have a problem with either the top or the bottom. To check with the 5-cut system, I'm gonna go ahead and remove my screw that I used earlier, and I'm gonna cheat by putting my screw back in here. With my 2-cut method, I found that this is where my fence needs to be for both of my boards to be straight. So we're gonna check the 2-cut method where I added my screw with the 5-cut method. Over on William Ing's channel, he explains this a whole lot better than I'm gonna be able to do it here. So I'll leave a link in the description so that you can go and check out his video. But essentially what I'm gonna do is make a cut. So I've got my first cut here, make my second cut, make my third cut, flip it again and cut my fourth. And if my fence is lined up correctly, I should have a 90-degree angle in each corner. To check to see if each one of these corners is correct, I'm gonna cut a strip off on this side, which is gonna be my 5th cut, and then I'll use a caliper to measure the top and the bottom piece of my 5th cut. The 5th cut has the letter A and B written on it. I'll go ahead and check the measurement of both. Letter A is 7035 and B is 0.7195. So I'll take 0.7035, subtract 0.7195, and that comes to 0.016. So we've got a difference of 0.016 inches over a length of 18 3/4 of an inch. That does sound a little abstract, so let's break this down into something that's a little bit more relatable. Imagine the thickness of a standard piece of printer paper, about 0.0039 inches. Our difference here is just a bit more than 4 pieces of paper stacked together, over a distance of nearly 19 inches. That's really tight. But what if we stretch this out? Let's say we're working with a longer board, maybe an 8-foot piece of stock. With the same error per inch, that difference would only be about a 1/16 of an inch from one end to the other. So even if you're cutting something as long as 8 feet, the level of precision would only result in a taper that's just about a 1/16 of an inch. For most woodworking projects, that's incredibly accurate and within acceptable tolerance. But if you really want to get accurate, we can make that error per inch even smaller. I've got Williams' formula over here. I've already subtracted A minus B. Now I need to divide that by 4, which are the 4 corners. That comes to 0.004. I've already mentioned that the length of this is 18 3/4. So I need to divide that by 18.75. That comes to 0.00021333. Now I'm gonna multiply this number by my pivot point and my adjustment. So we're gonna make this easy. I'm gonna set this, my pivot point's over here, I'll set this to 22 inches altogether. So I'll multiply that by 22. That comes to 0.0046933333. Now that I know how far off it is, which way do I move it? Because my fence is on a pivot, I can either move it this way or I can move it this way. Ing explains it like this. The blade and the fence are at a 90. You have 1, 2, 3, 4 all the way up to 90. And then if you go below that, you're going to have negative 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 all the way down the other way. Because this came out to being a negative number, it means that my fence is too far this way. And it means I need to move my fence this way by 0.004. I calculated my adjustment point as being 22 inches for my pivot point, which is right here. Because I want to move my fence forward, I'm going to take a feeler gauge and place it right against that point. I am rounding this to 0.005, but I'll take a piece of stock with a point on it and I'll put it right up next to that point. Once I've got it against the point, I can add a clamp. And now I know that at this point right here, it's exactly where I want my fence to be. So now I'm going to go ahead and remove the screw in the back, pull my feeler gauge out, and move my fence just enough to hit that point. Let's say your fence is too high. You'll place your stock against the fence, clamp it down, take the screw out, and then put the feeler gauge between the 2 points and press it forward before drilling a new hole and adding a screw. I'll remove my screw now, and I can move the fence forward just that little bit. It's very hard to see a difference, but there's a slight difference. Now I can add a clamp and add my screw. We'll cut this again and we'll see how close we are now. Letter A is 1.125 and letter B is 1.1255. Woohoo! We're not quite done yet. We still need to add screws to the back side, so I'm going to go ahead and add some screws along the fence, and that is going to be the thicker part here. Something that you might consider adding is some WD-40. I put it along my tracks and it just gives me a little bit better movement, but that's really up to you. I'll add my safety block on the back, something that you really should add. Originally I had suggested using this block and really it just fits in the back like this, but I thought there's still a chance that somebody might put their finger underneath like this, so I actually switched it out to a piece that's a little bit larger. Then I just cut this little corner out here. You can do it either way. I think that this is a little bit better, and I will adjust the website accordingly, but we just need to add some glue to this and then slide it in. One thing to note is that I'm not going to add any glue to the bottom side. I don't want to glue it to the top of my base. I just want to glue it to the actual fence. That will give me the option of removing this later on if I need to. I rounded the edges on the fence. It's nice, but optional. Finally, I added a poly to the open wood grain that will strengthen the fibers as well as make sure it doesn't swell in the future. Make sure if you're going to do this to use oil instead of water finish to prevent the grains from being raised. I think spray poly is a better option here as there's less of a chance of it dripping and causing a problem later on. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will have some add-ons for this in the future. Let me know what you think of this in the comments down below. Please also thank my patrons that make this possible with the website, and you will find the website in the description down below. Remember to keep making things.